Welcome everyone to our backpack series, presentation Intersectionality and Disability Justice, bringing our full selves to schools and communities with Carrie Basas, hosted by the Seattle Special Education PTSA. I know that all of you could be spending your time doing a lot of different things tonight, and so really appreciate that you've chosen to be here with us and part of this presentation. I do want to point out that this is part of a broad series of presentations we've done throughout the year. But of course, October being Disability History and Awareness Month, this was organized by the Seattle Special Education PTSA and the Family and Community Engagement Committee. Many of you who know Yana is in the back end here tonight, but she worked to coordinate this event as well as other members of the committee and the board. So we are an all-volunteer organization, and what we do is to provide support to families and teachers and advocate for equal opportunities for all students. We provide information, we gather input, and collaborate with the district in the interest of our students. So appreciate everybody who put in time to help put this together for you all. My name is Pam, and I will be the moderator tonight. I'm also the co-VP on the board, and we're really excited to have Carrie here and really appreciate her taking the time to present this topic to us tonight. Before we jump into the presentation, we're going to go over a couple norms. So when we take space, we want to make sure that we also make space. Also, I'm going to turn it over here soon to Carrie, but I want to introduce her. Carrie is the director of the Governor's Office of the Education of Ombuds, or OEO, as you might often hear, where she works with families and schools to center anti-racist, anti-ableist practices and resolve concerns collaboratively. Before directing the OEO, Carrie was a disability and civil rights lawyer, law professor, and nonprofit director and founder. A disabled mother and activist, Carrie lives with her spouse and daughter in Seattle, where her daughter attends public school and receives special education supports.
Thanks again for having me, and thanks as a parent. I understand, especially during the pandemic, doing anything at night, even from your basement, even in your yoga pants, is a haul. So I apologize in advance if you see a middle schooler run in the back, a spouse, or you hear a dog barking. When I was invited to come and talk about disability, particularly during this month, which is Disability History and Pride Month, I thought about how we should talk about racial justice as well. And I will just say from the beginning that I do not live as a person of color. I have different intersecting identities, but I think my work as a white parent in Seattle Public Schools, as well as in my role in the governor's office, is to learn how to act in solidarity. So that's the perspective that I am bringing as a disabled person with multiple identities but my racial identity being white. But I just wanted to make sure that we took an expansive view and an accurate view about disability. So I wanted to describe before getting started. It looks like my internet connection isn't awesome. So I wanted to describe before getting started the picture over on the right. And it says, it's a t-shirt that says, "Don't let your lack of disability define you." And so many of the messages that we hear about disability say, don't let your disability define you. And so today tonight, I want to talk about the ways in which letting your disability define you can be positive and a source of community. And I don't think that that's necessarily what we hear in special education circles and education in general. I want to acknowledge, Schou, that we are on the unceded ancestral lands and traditional territories of the Puget Sound Coast Salish people. And as you might know, OSPI and Washington's tribal nations created a curriculum called the Since Time Immemorial curriculum, which focuses on the vibrant contributions in the past and now of our tribal nations in Washington. I know that the PTA outlines some norms. I want to share some norms that I think are inclusive and disability-centered spaces. So I'd like to invite you all to make your own space and experience. Attend to your body, mind. That's not our experiences. I have a migraine today, so I can tell you it's affecting all of me. Take a break and engage in ways that are restorative to you. We always need to center justice, and we want to invite each other to go beyond our own experiences. So much of this is deeply personal and why we're drawn to the work, but we need to look outside of our own experiences. And I see this myself every day, because when I realize that learning is everywhere, and especially from one another. Before we start talking about disability identity and intersectionality, I provided a list here. I'll read through it quickly, about the multitude of identities that we can have. And over on the right is a colorful set of boxes of cargo containers, which are familiar to us in Seattle, right? But they have those heavy steel bars on them. And when I see these in relationship to identity, I think about all the ways that we're separate. And they're closed off. You can only have one identity at a time, or it's the thing that the person sees or thinks they see, and they respond to you. So in terms of identities that we see for everyone and occurring with disability is race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender identity, sex, sexual orientation, body size and shape, age, national origin, primary and or first language, immigration status, religious or spiritual practices and beliefs, veteran status, and disability. And the disability community or communities encompasses all of this as well. But the message that many disabled people get, as do people of color and others, is that they are supposed to just have one identity. And I saw this lovely quote in Breathe, which is not a disability studies book, but is a book by Imani Perry. It's a letter to her sons, and talking about identity. And Imani says, people want to truncate you. Sometimes you'll make a bold statement claiming the fullness of your being, and it will feel essential and groundbreaking. And then you will walk outside or inside and be reminded that the shortcut is back. I see that so much in disability, and for various communities in disability, about not being able to, or facing punishment for claiming a positive identity. Think about the beauty of deaf culture, for example, and this backlash against some identities or reclaiming of certain labels and languages. Today, I wanted to talk, as I mentioned.
We could pause just
one minute. Switch yes.
Interpreters.
Great.
Okay, we're good.
Okay, great, thank you. So as I mentioned, given the moment that we're in, and in every moment, we have to talk about race when we're talking about disability, and we must talk about race in general. But I have two images here, and one on the left is a sign that a concerned mother put up related to her Black son. It says, "Attention, an autistic man lives here. He does not know what a cop is or what a gun is. He makes loud noises. He will not hurt you. He does not understand words or commands. And oh yes, he is Black too." And what we see in police violence is that a great number of the people who are victims of police violence are people of color with disabilities. And so it's really important to think about the ways that that experience is shaping the US and is shaping communities of color as well as disabled communities. And it will continue to. There's such vulnerability in that. And then the image on the right I've selected is an image of power. And you see there is a person who's sitting in a wheelchair holding a Black Lives Matter sign, and also behind them is a sign that says Black Disabled Lives Matter. And there is a woman of color crouching down in a megaphone with a megaphone. So we're seeing an image of solidarity that's bringing together communities and recognizing identities as being important and sources of wholeness. Today, we're hearing a lot about intersectionality. And in some ways, it's become very buzzy. It's a buzzword. And I'm sure that we would have different definitions of intersectionality if we took a poll right now. But looking back to the original work by Professor Crenshaw, intersectionality is not about parallels. It's the way that people have individual identities that intersect and impact how they are viewed, understood, and treated. And we'll talk about that because there's also discrimination in the disability rights movement that is important to call out and repair. And Mari Matsuda, I was a law professor before this job. Professor Matsuda, I've always loved this, always says to ask the other question. So in any room that you're in, for example, this will hit close to home, maybe. If you're in a PTA meeting and it's about special education, are there disabled adults there? Are there students with disabilities there? I just want to take a pause and note that I use identity first language in talking about disability. So disability is critical to my identity. I see myself as having physical and mental impairments and experiences, but that I am disabled by society and attitudinal and structural barriers. So you will hear me say disabled person often instead of, or disabled people or student instead of using person first language, people with disabilities. So I just mentioned, do we see disabled adults in those rooms? Are disabled adults in our leadership and making decisions? Are they in our leadership in special education departments? Are they our legislators? Are disabled people of color making decisions about disproportionality? So when we say ask the other question, we ask who isn't here? What haven't we discussed and why? I want to go quickly over what a disability is, because if you have been to an IEP meeting, you think you know what one is, right? And I have a daughter, and I could go to the doctor and they could tell me what a disability is. But I wanted to provide a perspective from a disabled woman's lens on what a disability is to me and what it means for me to be in community with other disabled adults. So my controversial position today, maybe, I know I have some company here, is that disability is kind of made up. So there's a disability and then there's an impairment. An impairment is something that happens to your body or your mind. A disability is what we have made of it in terms of society. It's where desirable, what conforms. You can think about many examples historically in medicine where transsexualism was in the old DSM, the Psychological Diagnostic Manual. Disability and sexuality has been stigmatized. The term amok refers to being perceived as being out of control, but is a term that was used against Pacific Islanders. And disability comes down to how our bodies and minds, through their experiences, are interacting with points of power and who was in charge of designing communities. So as I mentioned earlier, my language is identity first. I use disabled to reclaim community and history rather than to make it all centered on the ways in which my body or mind behave a little bit differently from yours, which is true for all of us if we're being honest about it. But we have stigmatized some experiences over others. You may have had discussions or may not have had discussions about the term ableism. And often when we think about disability, we think about access and inclusion. And I would say that we need to confront that there's real bigotry and hatred towards people with disabilities or disabled people. And Stacey Park Milburn, who was an amazing activist who passed away this year, there's a picture, a Korean American person who's wearing a black shirt that says Catalyst for Change and has a trach. Stacey called ableism a system of oppression that favors being able-bodied or able-minded at any cost, and frequently at the expense of people with disabilities. So we'd say this is our culture of enforcing ideas of what is normal or acceptable in terms of the way that minds or bodies move and behavior. What it is that we want to fix in others that makes us uncomfortable. And ableism is not something that ever works in favor of disabled people. And disabled people similarly can internalize ableism from growing up in a culture that tells them that they need to be different, that they need to look different, that they need to sit still, that they need to use appropriate language at all times, that they shouldn't stim, for example. So what is happening in disability activism right now is a really important shift that centers racial justice. An old framework is disability rights, where we think about civil rights laws and policies. We talk about access, which is really important. We need that as a building block, and inclusion in mainstream society. The reality is that all these decades after the Americans with Disabilities Act, we haven't seen significant changes in the employment of disabled people or in community inclusion. We aren't where the founders of that act thought we would be. And so rights are not enough. And the disability rights movement has largely been led by people who also have great access to economic resources, are white, are men, and don't have stigmatized disabilities. So would be more likely to use a wheelchair, for example, versus have a mental health disability. But what's coming out of the excitement of disability justice is it's a grassroots movement led by the people who are most impacted. And we're talking about Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ plus people, and at those intersections. And it talks about how we are all interdependent, that our goal in disability shouldn't be to say, let's get this student or person to be as independent as possible, but it's to recognize that each of us, disabled or not, is and should be connected to someone else, that no one's access needs should be too much. And the idea is that we can promote, if we have a disability justice perspective, collective access. It is not me fighting for a particular outcome in my daughter's IEP, for example. It is me stepping back and saying, what is happening to other people in this situation? What is happening behind me, for example? I have family members. Anyway, sorry. Little distraction in the back, you know that I'm at home. So what is happening? What does it mean if I'm experiencing this? If we're getting this call in our office, who am I not hearing from? Who has the access to power to say, call an Ombuds office? And what does it mean to go beyond and take care of one another? The disability justice movement is inherently intersectional, is a cross movement, and is cross disability. And so it says that we can learn from the LGBTQ plus movement about how we can have disability justice, that we can also similarly learn from communities of color and what's happening when it comes to fighting anti-Blackness and celebrating Black brilliance in lifting up our brothers and sisters of color who have disabilities as well. And so and how can we inform one another and talk about the stigma there is, for example, this conversation that I often have in a cross movement of how much stigma there is in identifying as a disabled person, especially in particular cultures and scenarios. And if you're a person of color, being further labeled, especially, for example, and I'll talk about this in a second, If you have a mental health disability, for example, if you're already perceived as being violent or aggressive, and to then share that you have this additional diagnosis or identity, it starts to increase the bias and violence that happens toward you because of the ways in which you're perceived. I wanted to share some examples at the intersection of ableism, racism, colonialism, and other oppressions. This is another quote, and not from a disabled author, but this promise with a local author that you will get more because they exist to get less is woven throughout our entire society. So over on the right, I have an image of there's no me without you. I, for example, couldn't be defined as disabled without someone else determining that they aren't disabled. We can't have this category without someone in a position of power separating themselves out and naming this other thing, such as disability or being Black, Indigenous, or a person of color as bad or less than. So these are the ways in which though the oppression is created. And also, there's this great work going on to talk about how we can't have ableism without racism, because both are systems in which we have decided that some people's lives are worth supporting and are valuable, and others are a drain on our society and contribute nothing. And that some people are normal and acceptable while others aren't. So there's so many common experiences. And also we need to remember that people with disabilities, I joke, are more than white ladies with canes. I don't have my cane with you, but me right here, but it would be more funny if you saw me with it. But that is that's my sit down joke for now. Okay, so intersectional oppression and pathologizing, especially with anti-Blackness. I mentioned that the whole concept of disability is defined by this idea of what is normal. I did not participate in determining what is normal, and I would say it's safe to say that other marginalized communities did not. Are we going to have an interpreter switch? Great.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, great, thank you. So what we have seen is that disabled people and communities of color are historically and currently marginalized. We all know that. But what is particularly oppressive is when we look at the history of disabling people of color, that our ideas about disability and control were first directed against people of color. When we talk about what happens in stigmatizing disability and race, we see an exponential growth in poor outcomes. So disproportionality and discipline, incarceration. I was at a fundraiser recently, and I do need to get this source, where they said that 60%, this was astounding to me, but it was a reputable organization, 60% of Black boys with disabilities who enter adulthood will be incarcerated at some point in their lives. We look at police brutality, where figures have ranged from 50 to 70% of victims of police brutality that are people of color are also disabled. And medical racism is rampant. We think about sterilizations that have happened to communities of color and justifications for that. They're deeply tied to disability. And on the flip side, we need to look at where we invest and where we don't invest. And we see that playing out with COVID. You hear that COVID disproportionately affects communities of color, as if there's something special about the genetic makeup of the disease. It is not the genetic makeup of the disease, it is the genetic makeup of our society and structural racism that has caused those disproportionalities. We see them particularly in communities of color, of people with disabilities, because people with disabilities themselves live in poverty and face stereotypes and poor attitudes from doctors about the value of their lives and providing care and triage services, for example. So we have to look at where we invest in education and health and social services to understand how we multiply marginalize people and exacerbate disability and exacerbate racism. Those two systems feed one another, and that is the way it was intended to be set up. I think also about the extremes of representation. You will see that there are very few images about disability in general, but the images that you see when it comes to communities of color and disability are on hyperdrive. It's racism on hyperdrive. The Black, aggressive, crazy, disabled man, the, person, so the Spanish speaking child who, because Spanish is their primary language, can never learn in an English speaking school. And these really disgusting assumptions of what it means to be a person of color and have a disability. But in general, when you look at images of disability, they're often ones of pity and charity, or they're ones of fear that disabled people are going to ruin our workplace and not be productive, that they're angry and they're going to sue us, that they are unhinged and they were going to come for us. So there are very few positive images of disability, though those are increasing, but largely because of the work of disability justice activists. And we have to look at our history here in Washington and across the world about what we have done to Indigenous communities as well. We have a long history of having Native boarding schools in which disabilities were not only exacerbated, where language was taken away, but disabilities were caused through the trauma that was inflicted, the psychological and physical violence of those places. We also see forced mental health care greater in communities of color, especially LGBTQ plus communities of color as well. So it's pathologizing people's experiences. I said that early on that disability rights can be a racist movement. I didn't really know about disability rights growing up. I was in a separate school for kids with disabilities until 3rd grade. And then I was finally mainstreamed. And my daughter has a disability, and that is my personal experience with parenting and having a child who has an IEP. But I will say that when I came to know about disability, what it looked like was a founding fathers kind of model of professional men who were fully employed, gainfully employed in respectable fields, who were making legal and policy change. And that was the history that I was presented, but that is not the full, true, or accurate history of what disability rights has looked like. But within the disability rights movement, even with that, in disability conversations and parents' movements, we see legacies and active forms of white supremacy. There's heteronormativity as well. There's a hierarchy of disabilities, which could be its own conversation. There is ableism, discrimination, and oppression of disabled people by other disabled people, because so many of us have been taught, we've just been taught to lift ourselves up by our bootstraps. And we have bathed in all of the stereotypes about disability that others who aren't disabled have too. Especially as we have received messages that we should try to be more normal or different. As I mentioned, there's cis white male leadership with more socially acceptable disabilities, and a focus on independence and autonomy and the overcoming narrative. You can open any newspaper or turn on any TV station, and I will bet you some money for the week that you will find a story about a very cute kid or someone else who has overcome their disability, the tragedy and sadness of their disability. I don't see disability as tragedy and sadness. I see it as a different way of moving in the world, which is another reason why I have a bit of a meltdown quietly often, sometimes not as quietly, when people use the language of special needs. My needs are not special. And when you say that something is special, you say that it's optional and it's up to someone else to decide. It's out of the generosity of their heart that they would help you or not. They are human needs, and we have to meet people where they are. And I think in our disability rights movement, there's also been a lack of attention to linguistically diverse communities and their access needs. So I have placed this picture over on the right. It's in my favorite genre of photos. Perhaps you all have a favorite genre of photos. My husband likes cute animal photos and videos. This is my weird genre of photos. I love photos that could never happen in real life for disabled people. So here is a picture of it seems like a white man with graying hair in a plaid shirt sitting in a manual wheelchair in the sand, edge of a beach. A regular old wheelchair. Some people out in the water enjoying themselves. I guess he's pondering his cell phone. When I see photos like this, you have stuck a disabled person into a setting, right? We need to make an inclusive photo. So here, this person in this photo probably doesn't even have a disability. We put the wheelchair there, they walked to it, they sat down, and we have this photo. Our community is inclusive. Maybe I think too much. How did this person ever get to the sand in that wheelchair? If you've ever used a wheelchair or watched them, that is not a chair that would go out in the sand. But we have this photo of this guy just hanging out like everyone else, and without realizing the structural barriers that exist. And this is a perfect photo too, because it is a photo of all the things I was talking about. Here's a very clean cut, white seeming man, just looking down. He's got a freshly pressed shirt. This is our idea of what disability is. It's about joining the party of some non-disabled people. And this is a really unrealistic photo on many levels. I want to talk about current problems as part of our historical legacy. So I won't have time to go through everything, but as some of you know, our mental asylums started in the 18th century, if not before. And what we saw was those mental asylums started to be filled by immigrants in the 19th and 20th centuries. And schools, our history of schools, even in Washington State, if you look at the archives, were social organizations and family organizations that came together to want to create schools where immigrants and other people that they perceived as deviant could receive socialization and moral training. They could become better Americans. And so by 1815, formal deaf education begins in the US, and the first special ed programs were beginning around that time that were really focused on delinquent kids, or those they perceived as delinquent, at risk. And by this, if you look at the registry, even the archives of schools around the state, Seattle Public Schools has an amazing archive, for example. These were really disproportionately immigrant, refugee, Black kids in these programs. The early 20th century was the rise of special schools based on specific disabilities, so separation and sorting by disability. The 20th century, we've seen institutions and private schools. We shouldn't forget that as a large part of the Holocaust involved Nazi mercy killing programs focused on disabled people, among other marginalized communities. And the first half of the century had such things as ugly laws, which were supposed to produce fines if a disabled person was on the street and someone was offended by seeing them. There were regimes of sterilization of disabled people, particularly in communities of color, and eugenics movement. So we had this idea of what an ideal body, mind, citizen would be. 1970, we saw a disabled teacher fight for their license, and 1972, only half of children were receiving an appropriate education that had disabilities, and a quarter were receiving no education at all. It really wasn't until 1999 that we talked about how unnecessary institutionalization is a form of discrimination. So I often am in settings where people say, wow, like what's happened with special ed in the past 5, 10, 20 years? Well, what's happened with special ed is our entire history that goes beyond back before the 18th century. And this is what we're living in, and this is what we have not overcome. So systemic bias, disability bias in Washington schools is real. And over here on the left, I talked about one of the main movements in 19th century or 20th century schooling was separate schools. Here is a picture, a black and white image of a mid-century school for spastic children in Seattle. I believe that one was in Queen Anne. And so here's an image of teachers or parents and kids with various equipment that are out front of this schoolhouse. So there was sorting based on that. And it was a school that came together, I understand, largely from parent efforts, and just to make sure that kids were receiving education. I love that that building doesn't even look very accessible, but you know, just just how it is. So that was from the mid 20th century. What I always try to emphasize with people is that 20% or 1 out of 5 people have disabilities. And because there's so much stigma about disability, people are often shocked by that number. Like, I don't see 20%, or now the number is closer to 25%. I don't see that many people with disabilities out and about. And that says a lot about the social isolation of disabled people, as well as the stigma there is in coming out about disability. We look in Washington, our graduation rate for disabled students is 59%, and it's a 35% dropout rate for students with learning disabilities. A bachelor's degree is about half for disabled people versus non-disabled people in our state. 56.6% of working age people with disabilities in Washington state are not in the workplace. And 19.5% of people with disabilities have incomes below 100% of the poverty level and 43% below 200% of the poverty level. And the non-disabled rates are 10 and 23%. So we see a doubling of poor outcomes, and those outcomes become even worse when you put them at the intersection of another marginalized identity. I wanted to share that, you know, it is Disability History and Pride Month, which happy month, it's almost over. And did you know, and Seattle Public Schools sent this out, so I'm very appreciative, that more than 10 years ago, the legislature said that we need to talk about disability in Washington state, and that every school needed to teach about it in October. Yet the legislature never provided resources to do that. So our office came along and created a learning resource that centered disabled voices, was made with disabled filmmakers, disabled teachers, and allies to talk about disability from that perspective and from an intersectional disability justice perspective. And that project is called 1 out of 5. And I have the link here, but we have 6 student videos of disabled students in Washington, various parts of Washington with different identities and disabilities, sharing their experiences. And then we have learning units focused on just introduction to disability, disability history in Washington, disability history in the United States, intersectionality, and allyship and solidarity. We also have modifications for elementary school, remote learning, Black Lives Matters, and emphasizing to the disproportionate impacts of COVID, actually just amplifying the structural racism that already exists.
If we could pause for just one moment, switch
Great.
interpreters. We're good to go.
So I am really curious, and you could put this in the chat. I will check the chat now, but I'd like to take just a minute to ask you, if you want to share, you can. What story would you like students with disabilities to be able to tell about disability and race in your school or in Seattle? And what would that story mean to your community? And I will read some of them as we go if you want to share some, but I just am very interested in what would you like to be able to say about disability and racial justice in your school in Seattle, and what would that mean to you? Yana asked, something we see or something we wish for? Something you wish for, something you're working towards when you think about disability and racial justice. I see that Josephine says that they got to be involved in determining the supports they receive. Yes, I bristle a little, and I know that other disabled people do use this term, the idea of self-advocates, because disability is our movement. Parents are the allies or accomplices acting in solidarity. So it's by default that we are the advocates. There's no need to put self around it. But as we've structured it, it's more the rarity that we listen to and are led by disabled students. There's some other great stuff coming in here. To teach students who are deaf and deaf plus to become their own self-advocates, yes, after they graduate high school and into the work world. Yes, thank you, Sophie, for that. It's so important to have community in that too, because it is a lonely process, and sometimes we put too much on disabled or deaf kids to say, just go out and advocate, it'll all be good. But you need those advocacy skills and community. Laura says, not every deaf, hard of hearing kid will speak perfect spoken English. Some will be more comfortable communicating through sign language, and they are intelligent human beings. Yes, amazing human beings who have a language that communicates things that spoken English does not, and should be held up and valued as much as anything else, any other way of communicating. Vivian says, to make others aware of how disability is socially constructed. Absolutely. I think that people don't think about that. It's like you have a disability or you don't. But we know, working in this space, caring about disabled students, that disabilities are produced by society. They're also exacerbated by the environments that we're in. So, and Josephine says, holistic recognition that you can need support even if you are academically talented. I think that's indeed part of meeting people where they are. And a lot of fight too over accommodations sometimes we see, right? That, oh, but you know, they're doing okay without an accommodation. I say this, I used to be a law professor, and my colleagues would say, they're doing okay without an accommodation. You know, they've got a B and they got the accommodation and they got an A. So they didn't really need it. It's sort of gaming. It's like, no, they're academically talented students, and that extra time or quiet space was what they needed. Why are we assuming the worst? Holistic recognition, yes. Genesis for teachers to weave into their curriculum awareness of disability and the strengths of disabled persons. Yeah, and we have seen that in our learning resource too, that many teachers are afraid to talk about disability, and adults too. But our children are much better at thinking about disability holistically than we are. And so it can be reassuring to adults to know that. Miriam writes that they are not defined by standardized testing to measure what they are capable of. And absolutely, we see such structural racism and linguism and other forms of oppression and standardized testing. And how do we recognize, how do we approach it from a strength space? Yana said early identification of learning disabilities and understanding of the impact of lack of support of disabled students, not perceiving disability related behaviors as will or being bad. Yeah, let me see. A colleague was telling me about a discussion about attendance and someone framing it as being willfully truant. And I think about, why would we ever want to think of kids as not wanting to be in school? Like, really just like, put it in your face, I don't want to be in school, or I don't want to get along with my peers. And just this idea that somehow disabled kids are getting in the way of other people's experiences. Laura wrote that no one should be ashamed for using accommodations. Some people who are not disabled will benefit from accommodations. Yeah, I think there's so many times. I was just talking to a group of college students in Florida last week, AmeriCorps volunteers, and we were talking about disability and race. And it came up that a few of the students said they didn't disclose their disabilities at school. They had them, but they didn't tell anybody because they didn't want anyone to make a big deal out of their accommodations. So they tried to make things work for themselves, but it took so much effort and they struggled more than they ever needed to. Sherilyn writes, I would wish my son tells people, yes, he's going to vote. Yes, he understands the issues and candidates. And yes, he has the right to vote. Yeah, I think the disabled vote is something that's really undertapped. And however you're going to vote, vote. That they feel, Catherine writes, that they feel seen and heard and have their strengths valued and supported in addition to deficits. I think leading with those strengths is so important. We all have things that we're not going to be great at doing. Wow, I'm not going to make it through all the chat. You guys are doing very well here. You all, okay, I'm going to do themes. Race and disability to not be the only thing you see when you see a struggling student. Think about students as unique. Families to be aware and proactively informed of their rights. Teach how disability and race are strongly interwoven and rights were fought standing together. And one of the most powerful images is of, if you all have seen Crip Camp, it's a really great documentary that came out several months ago, maybe longer. We're in COVID time now. It's hard to tell how much time has gone by. But just images of Black Panthers bringing food to disabled people in sit-in and making sure that they had personal care attendants so they could occupy the federal building. And members of that sit-in also being members of the Black Panthers, not separate. And that we are all educators no matter what, absolutely. I'm going down. There's so many good ideas here. So I'm speaking truth about how having a disability is made harder by the system. When you're a person of color, hold on, yeah. Not all people with disabilities are given the same access because of race, and they have to deal with discrimination because of race, and they feel like outsiders in their community because of disability. And I'd like to talk about how they navigate finding a community of support system and supports all of them. Inclusive history, your age shouldn't limit your ability to learn. You want students to feel pride about their disability and race. Learn more, have more, love more understanding that anti-racist work isn't away from anti-ableist work and vice versa. I think there's so many ways in which social justice movements are set up to fight one another, and there's no way that that should be. It's the tool of the oppressor, right? And we can exacerbate abuse and trauma. And universal design, accessibility, have the walls of classrooms covered with LGBTQIA+ disabled POC to see their stories in the books of the class and not just during Pride months. We're working on some posters for that, so we're really excited. More dialogue about visible and invisible disabilities for sure. Knowing that you're worthy and deserve to belong, that no teacher is a bully, solidarity, get involved. Don't judge a book by their cover. Think about communication supports, mindfulness and no judgment. All these beautiful things and this envisioning that you have and the things we work towards. And I hope that that provides you with hope too. You're in this shared space with others who want that. So we see, as I mentioned, and we even listed some things, that we see so many negative images about race and about disability, and especially the intersection of that oppression. And yet these are some images that we need to see. We need to see this newspaper from the Black Panther Intercommunal News Service showing the supports that were given. The headline is Handicapped Win Demands End to the HEW occupation. And that was for the Section 504 regulations to be signed. It's an amazing image of power. And those of you who don't know about Marsha P. Johnson, this amazing trans, Black, disabled activist who was part of Stonewall riots and fought So I have another point of reflection, and then we're going to be and then I want to open it up to questions in a minute, but I'd love to see you all light up the chat again. How will you act in solidarity to foster this space for others without speaking for them, which is huge. And Ijoma Oloa, who is a writer here in Seattle, says that when we identify where our privilege intersects with somebody else's oppression, we find our opportunities to make real change. And I think that's always important. Even as a marginalized person, I think about the privileges that I do have and that are many, even though I may walk outside my door and be treated as someone who is incompetent. And people are shocked to know they have a job or a kid, or I drive a car, or someone comes up to me at the grocery store and it's just wants to applaud that I was at a grocery store. I mean, all of these experiences happen. Yeah, I have a lot of privileges as well. It just doesn't feel like that in the moment. So we each have a moment, space in which we have that privilege. So how are you going to act in solidarity without silencing others? Laura was talking a bit about being okay with classrooms for deaf and hard of hearing students because communication is better and more accessible. So we don't want to put students anywhere that they don't have accessible communication. Anyone else? So do folks want to share how they plan to act in solidarity with others, especially during this time? Call out ableism and help educate other people who look and live like me. I think that's always an interesting question for me. I see parents really change their ideas about disability. I've seen it happen over time, and I haven't even been in this job very long. I think I'm marking up my own slides. I haven't been in this job very long, and I've seen, like, in 5 years, parents' ideas just change radically and just be amazing allies and accomplices for fighting ableism. Speak at the school board meetings. You can share your experience, and there is important advocacy to stand back when people from marginalized groups are speaking up and listen to them, and use my own privilege to amplify their voices with them, not over them. It's so important too to identify also what is it that somebody wants. I mean, sometimes we want to be helpful and we identify something that is not what someone wanted either. As a PTSA leader, I will create space for students receiving special education services and their families and learn from them to inform our advocacy. Parking lot chats work for me, and continue to push for people experiencing oppression to have the loudest voice in what they need. I think it's always changing who people are hearing from, right? And calling out people who are mistreating disabled students, asking for corrective action. Eileen asked me to speak to the idea of disability first versus people first language. Parents are coached to use people first, but as we learn from teens and adults with disabilities, we need to shift. Could do that as one of the questions too, or as an early one. So I can get to the language question before we go into questions, but I just wanted to share this piece as well, that this is another powerful quote from Stacey Park Milburn. We live and we love interdependently. We know no person is an island, and we need one another to live, and we all need support. So hierarchy of what support is okay to need and what isn't is just ableism. So I think that this idea, and this is very much like a white American, I know I'm oversimplifying, but it is this idea that is like held by most people in power here, that to strive towards an independence rather than recognizing the interdependence. And then there shouldn't be any voting or ranking of what need is okay, what help is okay to ask for, and what's not. And when we start to do that, when we put shame around that, when people are abused because of that, that's ableism. I mean, that's a deep-seated hatred of and oppression of disabled people. So there are many beautiful photos. I put put a link down here. The Disabled in Here project is changing a lot of the images around disability. It's free photo art. You can make a donation to them. And here is a picture of a Native person holding a sign, a prosthetic limb, and a burgundy shirt with embroidery and like black Bermuda shorts. It's this change and not tinker. I always think that we need to change things rather than a little fix here, a little fix for me, a little fix for you. We're going to try this. We're not really going to commit. No, we radically need to change things. And if we haven't learned that now, under these circumstances of COVID, after the amplification for people who were not aware of what was going on in terms of we're refusing to look at racial injustices, then I'm not sure when we're going to do it. It's really not a time to just change a little bit here and we'll get to it later. There's an opportunity to radically rethink what schools look like and how our relationships with one another are and how we're in just relationship with one another. I know there's a big push to go back to the way it was. And as someone who really doesn't want that and feels offended by that idea, it just shows that it was working for some people and not others. And it's time to really make that change. So I'd love to do questions. I wanted to address Eileen's question, but I also wanted to provide the link for our 1 out of 5 project. So going back to language quickly, the rough version. I think the biggest request I get when I'm asked to just do, I would say like baby disability training, not about babies, but it's like my first disability training is about language because everyone just wants to know the right thing to say so they don't offend anyone, which is really never a good place to start because I think to make change in how you think about disability and you act in justice with it, you have to be uncomfortable. And that goes for disabled people too within the movement. It's not like we're all born understanding each other's disabilities. You have to be uncomfortable and you will offend people. That's the first thing. There's not a list, but we were somehow given this idea that the existing list that's okay is people first language because it's the person before the disability, which to me says, and I will say that is the mainstream approach, people first. We're being polite. We're not putting the disability before the word person. But for me, that makes me, one, it doesn't seem to recognize the fact that I'm disabled is because of society. I didn't sign up for this. Someone else could, many people on this call have health issues that would not be considered to be disabilities, yet I bear the social stigma of having a disability and you don't. So I don't know where we drew that line. So the idea that like, oh, we're just going to be nice and put person before disability makes disability seem like it's a bad thing. So we'd never lead with that. Also that it's something happening to you, this person with a disability, versus it's something that we as a society created. So when people say that they're disabled, or sometimes I go too radical at the PTA meeting, I will say I'm a crip. I'm reclaiming the word cripple. And because it's been used against disabled people. So some people in intra-community talk will say they're Crips and my friends are Crips. It doesn't mean that we're in a gang. It means that we're reclaiming the word cripple. And the same thing with disabled. There's been this great writing about how if you say disabled, that means to me that you are talking about both the social experience of being disabled by society that has discriminated against you, has decided that your body or mind is indesirable. And you're also giving a call out to the wonderful disability community that exists, that it is an identity. It's not a person with Blackness. It's not a person with cis woman gender. It is, this is an identity as a source of community, as a source of oppression. And so reclaiming that word disabled is a good highlight of both the positive aspects of that as well as the social construction of it. That may not have been neat and tidy. The default is, people say is always use person first language. My default is to listen to what other people are using, disabled people, disabled students, not people who are working with students with disabilities or parents of students with disabilities, I say go to the source, see what language they're using, use that language if it's okay, ask what people want to be called, rather than kind of going for this meaningless politeness about something and evading conversations about disability. And then you're making them more stigmatized. And we're not comfortable talking about disability, so we're kind of going to dance around it. But people really aren't comfortable talking about disability, and I think that's something they just need to get over and just sit with, because disabled people and people of color are not comfortable in all spaces. And so to demand that you should be comfortable all the time is really a sign that you have a lot more power that you need to share or step back a second. So existential ponderings by me, I know we have questions to no differently abled. That is like saying physically challenged. We're all differently abled. This is, you're going to Carrie's School of Language. When someone says special needs to me, for example, or differently abled means nothing to me. Everybody in my office is differently abled. We just do things differently, like differently from what? And it's very similar to special needs. I was saying special needs is very optional. It's a euphemism. There have been studies about how the language of differently abled or special needs actually further stigmatizes and erodes claims to disability rights. Those words are not in law. So I don't think, one, they're an effective advocacy strategy besides being language that disabled adults wouldn't use about themselves. And then the other piece is they're meaningless. So I would joke that, like, my husband has special needs because he's my husband, and your partner or child or friend, like, there's something they do that annoys you or is really particular to them. And I think about those in my life now. That's how I'm using the word special needs. So I think you can use special needs in that way, that we all have very special needs at different times. Mine can be for storing chocolate in secret places in my house. My daughter says I'm really good at storing things in secretive locations. So that is a particular special need I have, but it has nothing to do with my disability at all. And I feel like when people talk about special needs or differently able, that they just don't want to acknowledge that I'm a disabled person who's in front of them, and that they're choosing the language. That is not language that any disabled adult that I know has chosen. And, there could be some out there. I'm not doing a poll at this point, but it's just not the language of what's happening in advocacy communities. So I'd love to take questions or other things. Someone else is going to moderate this for me. How can I be helpful?
This is Pam. I saw that Yana had a question. Yana, do you want to unmute, or would you like us to read it?
I think that Carrie already addressed it. I was just talking about the expression of differently abled almost. I've heard it used so many times. It almost seems like the word disability or disabled, it has a stigma. And I think it's not more of a question, but I guess the question would be, how do I, or if I even take the opportunity to call it out? Because I feel like if somebody is telling me that my child has special needs or is differently abled, I don't really feel comfortable with that. My children's needs are not special. They are not extra. They are needs, just like any other person's needs. And I just worry that people get defensive when I do that. And I wonder how to address that.
Well, I think it's really important to treat this as you would any other sort of belief system or family value that you have around identity. So, and this is a piece too that I think gets lost in IEP meetings as well, that people are coming together and they have different views about what disability is. The parent could have a different view than the child could have a different view than the teacher, they could all have similar views. But it's an absolutely appropriate boundary to say, this is what we believe as a family about disability. Just as it's an appropriate boundary to say, this is what we believe as a family about our religion or race or language, that it's not a deficit. So, let's just make that clear that this is what we think as a family. I understand that you can't tell someone else how they should describe their own experience, but I think if you're trying to push along other parents, that you can share articles blog posts by disabled people. I mean, Lawrence Carter Long had this great media campaign called Say the Word Disabled. There are many posts. There was a great video series by a Down Syndrome Association about special needs. They were like YouTube videos or PSAs. Like, there's some fun ways to kind of challenge that idea of what special needs are, and to share that that's not language that you hear being used by people who have the autonomy to describe themselves. And we should grant everyone that autonomy. Kids don't know how to talk about themselves necessarily either in terms of identity, but then I think it's really important that they know disabled adults and other disabled kids, and it's what, their culture and disability culture and deaf culture and language. And that's the beauty of it. No child should grow up in isolation, and non-disabled parents should know disabled parents and disabled adults and take their cues from them.
We could pause for just a moment to
Yeah.
switch. And we're good to go.
This is Pam. Let's take Josephine's question and then Janice.
Thank you. I have a question about if you might have any wisdom to offer in not wanting to act in a way that perpetuates stigma and wanting to validate the voices of the disability community, while also reconciling the needs and challenges of having to take more of a pathologizing approach in order to get access to needed immediate services within the special education world.
So it's a good question. I think the language currently, right, is one of deeply the medical model and pathologizing things. So they can be separate experiences. It is hard, say, for disabled kids to go through so much testing. And also, I just know from my experience growing up, as well as just seeing the kind of protections I have to give my daughter in medical appointments, is just hearing so many awful things about yourself and being written in this way that is all deficit-based. Strategically, you want to get as much information as you can from specialists to make sure that in the current system you get the services that you need. And at the same time, you work towards changing that system and being in community with disabled adults and disabled leaders and other disabled youth and disabled parents to build up that rightful positive identity about disability. I've even had to explain to my daughter, like, this is what we do to get you the supports that you need to learn, because the school system wasn't built with you in mind to learn. Teachers weren't given supports to teach kids who read differently or process auditory information in a different way, or didn't grow up speaking English as their first language. And so we give them this information, but it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. This is data for them. But unfortunately, those things become so intertwined. And I'll also say that this is why I have compassion for parents who do not, as hurtful as it might be to hear certain language, that may not know about disability justice or know about other ways about thinking about disability, because so much of their time early on is spent with medical professionals. And those who are educators within schools who are part of IEP teams too are trained, this is what it takes to have an IEP. We need these kinds of tests. We need to show this deficit at this level of deviation or so I think it's important to recognize that yes, in this moment you have that data, but that you're trying to work towards a system where every student is met where they are. And that data that you have right now to make it through to tomorrow is not what's going to define the student. So it's being really honest about what the purpose of that is. And I think younger kids can understand that. But it is a lot of like going back, and I know with my own child saying, this is really not about you. It's about how things are already set up, and it's kind of what we need to do. But meanwhile, we're going to go hang out with these other people after who have pride in their disability and know that the system is so messed up. We're going to try to dream a little differently.
Thank you, Janice.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about how schools can help our students to claim their identities as disabled persons, and how parents and caregivers, as allies of their students, should work within the IEP process to make sure that that's happening for their students, particularly as they're progressing, and particularly as they're in high school, nearing the end of their educational journey.
Well, I think it's really important, and I know this was in the comments as well from a couple people, that we teach about disability across our curriculum from the very beginning. We have that learning resource we created, but there's just this void. I mean, you don't hear about disability at school. So how do we make sure that when we're talking about science, we're talking about biology, for example, we can talk about the ways in which, our bodies and minds work in different ways. When we're talking about history, can we talk about the contributions of disabled people of color to the LGBTQ movement, or disabled scientists? There are opportunities. And I think the same struggle, this struggle is amplified when we think about all the advocacy that needed to happen to get ethnic studies in schools. We need to open these conversations so that disability is just not taboo. And then, so that's part of just embedding it, right? Multiple messages. I think we also, been thinking about systems change, we need disabled teachers and principals. We have some. They probably don't feel safe enough to come out about their disabilities, because many of us don't feel safe to come out about all of our disabilities and identities at work. I don't feel safe enough to share with you all my multiple disabilities and identities. I don't know you. But your boss could have decision-making power, as do your peers. And so you could be further stigmatized. So we need those images of disability on the daily. And then we have the piece about IEP meetings, and disabled students should be as involved in their IEP meetings and present from early on. I love the idea of student-led IEPs and student-led parent-teacher conferences. Even if that is something that's going to be anxiety producing for the student and they decide they can't do it, or the format isn't working for them and there's no way adults haven't figured out a way to work around it, which there should be a way. I think, students should always be involved in some sort of pre-conversation, if they're not going to be at the IEP, about what it is that they think they're doing well, what their dreams are, where they need some support. And we certainly don't want to wait until transition for that. And I know that students communicate in different ways, and sometimes parents aren't really sure what it is that their student wants. But their kids, we know what their interests are, even if communication might be different. And those are all things that are great to share. And sharing doesn't always have to be in an hour-long verbal discussion or a certain style of advocacy. So I think it's just whatever ways that students can participate early on is really important. And then connecting them with other disabled youth, like UW has the Do It program. There are disability advocacy organizations around. Rooted in Rights has an amazing storyteller series. So exposing young people to other disabled people telling their stories as well, and showing the ways in which those stories can be expressed. And give them a crash course in disability culture, really. But we need schools to sustain that from the very beginning too. So you're not the one holding the whole conversation at age 15, 16, 17.
This is Pam. We have other questions in the chat. I know we're also running close on time here. So how many more questions do you want to take, Carrie?
Let's do 2 more.
Okay. So I know you may have spoke to this question a little bit, but Laura asked, how do we work with parents or professionals who want to cure, hide the child's student's disabilities and brag about how their student overcame their disability and can hide their disability so well? And then after that question, we'll go to Dion. Thanks.
I think it's really important to, this is like a conversion campaign. It's only like converting people from one mindset to another, and how does it happen? And it's such an organic process. I think that people need to hear from others that they trust, that there is another way of thinking about things. And a baby step, which could feel like a radical step to a parent or professional, is reading and listening to the experiences of disabled people, consuming disabled media, so that through storytelling, someone can understand and have their perspective challenged. You can give someone links to a bunch of different things and say, I find that oppressive, and I welcome you to have those conversations with people too. I mean, do the work so that it's not always disabled people having to do the work in the moment, or wanting to hide and run from that, or just feeling like they were in another violent space. But one really great resource that Rudin Rights put together was a disabled parent storytelling project. It's on their website, and it's from the perspective of parents who have disabilities, what they would want other parents to know about either raising them if they grew up with a disability, or raising a disabled child. And I do think that parents can relate to one another. And so something like that can be an easier entree into that kind of conversation. I will just say personally that my parents knew nothing about disability rights or justice. I was raised to overcome and achieve and be as normal as possible. The whole goal was for me to be normal and have a lot of surgeries and just be like every other kid and not feel different. But it was a setup. My parents didn't quite realize it, because I'm always going to be different. I just am. And why is that bad? So it was set up for a goal that I could never reach. And not reaching it made me feel like there was something wrong with me. My parents are still grappling with that. And I was the one who had to share learning from like a professor about their own disability experience, not until I was in college, and finding a community that I thought about disability differently. But that has been 20 years, and those are still difficult conversations, because they're really proud, and they're also very pragmatic that they they supported me towards academic excellence, and that helped me in their minds overcome, air quotes, a physical disability. And I have gainful employment, and I have a nice life. And so what's wrong with that? But it hurts me that I can't share my disability pride with them. It hurts our relationship. And so I think it's easier probably to hear it from another trusted adult than to have that conversation 20 something years later with your own kid. But that might be the source for that parent too, or that teacher.
Thank you. So we'll take this last question. I'm going to read it off. It says from Dion, what is OSPI doing to move us towards universal design and holistic, inclusive education of disability, race, culture, ethnicity, LGBTQIA, etc.? What can we do to make this happen?
Well, Yeah, unfortunately, I don't work for OSPI. I mean, it's like this is going to be the shortest question I answer, but I understand. So I don't know. The answer is not enough. And I think that, universal design was called out in reopening. Focus on students furthest from educational justice was called out in the COVID reopening plans. We've talked a lot about social emotional learning and family engagement. What we're seeing though, and especially in this moment, is that more and more OSPI is talking about local control. And so that means your school board. So if local control is the model, then get to know your school board very well. Get to know your legislator very well. Especially identify legislators who might be outside of your area. I think about the legislators who are part of the members of color caucus, as well as legislators who are on both the House and the Senate committees, and talking to them about what your vision is. Because they have a lot of sway with professional organizations such as the WEA or the School Directors Association, and thinking about model policies, work groups, and that sort of thing. So I would not wait for OSPI. I would think about the activism that can happen at both that state legislative level, and also just think about the power of groups and think about multimodal advocacy. Now I sound like a bureaucrat, but think about, storytelling and media and activism at the school level and activism in conjunction with educators and with other families in other districts. So just trying to identify what it is that you want to build, and then reaching out to community organizations too, beyond parent groups. Think about disability advocacy organizations, deaf advocacy organizations, arts organizations, to kind of expand out, because there are others who are doing this work. It's a question of connecting with them. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you. Thanks for having me. Anyone can feel free to reach out if they'd like. I'm always happy to chat with people.
Thank you so much, Carrie. This is Pam. I want to be sure, did we just have an interpreter switch?
Yes, just switched interpreters.
We good to go? Okay, just checking. Thank you. So again, thank you so much, Carrie. This, I know for me, was really meaningful and impactful conversation, and really appreciate your time on this conversation. I know I can see from the chat, everyone is giving you accolades. So
Thank you.
So thank you so very much. I do want to cover a couple things really quickly, to just say, if this was really meaningful for you, to support the OEO, to go online, find out more. They're a wonderful organization. I know they've helped me personally so much, and us as a PTSA. So please do that. And also support the Seattle Special Education PTSA, or for those of you who aren't part of our board, and school district, to support your local PTSA. I know, so please put those links in the chat. And I also want to say thank you to the interpreters who are here tonight to make this meeting accessible. And thank you to Seattle Public Schools for providing that interpretation for families and participants. Thank you so much. And the last thing I really want to say is, come back, keep coming back to these meetings, keep having these conversations, find out more information through our website, through the websites and links that Carrie provided. But thank you all so much for being here. And we'll collect those questions and keep asking more and continue this work. It's really important work. Thank you so much, Carrie.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good night. And thanks for supporting OEO as well. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.